Do you have ambitions to do certain things in your life, passions that really fire you up? Is there any conflict between that and Buddhist practice or Buddhist Dharma? This is something that we'll look into in today's video. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So I got a question a while back from David Bosch, who asks, my main stumbling block currently is that it seems to me that Buddhism, in a way, wastes human potential or talent. It seems to me that people give up all their passions and ambitions. I've somehow the feeling that Buddhism could kill all my passions, all my ambitions, and all my curiosity I have and want to have. I simply don't want to accept a belief system which would force me to become a passive, quote-unquote, ordinary person. My question is, how compatible is Buddhism with scientific curiosity and artistic creativity? And I mean by that not just minimalism. Now, David asks a huge question here that go on to at length, and I have earlier videos on Buddhist art in particular, and also how Buddhism relates to minimalism, this kind of philosophy of life that has come up in the last few years, and I'll put links to those videos down below in the show notes in case you're interested. So as I say, this is a big topic. Before I delve into it, though, I just want to spend a second just to mention Patreon. Patreon is the way that you can help support this channel and the work that we're doing together and get fun things in response. And I have videos there that sort of behind-the-scenes videos where we've even started a book club recently where I've talked about some books we can read together, where there are ways for you to get audio-only editions of these videos that I'm doing, and you can have early access to videos before they're released to the general public. Things like that. So take a look if it interests you. I'll put a link to it down below in the show notes. So now on to David's question about passions and ambition. To begin with, there's absolutely nothing wrong in early Buddhist Dharma, or indeed any Buddhist Dharma, about lay people having jobs, having great ambitions for themselves, even for them to make money. That's part of what a lay person is supposed to do. The Buddha, in fact, extolled the idea of what he called a righteous wealth righteously gained. The layperson is supposed, in a sense, to pursue righteous wealth righteously gained. In other words, wealth that is gained ethically, without any kind of deviousness, by our own hard work, without theft, without any kind of underhandedness, without lying, and so on. As long as we're pursuing this kind of these kinds of ambitions ethically and pursuing ambitions that are themselves ethical, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing so. Indeed, for the Buddha, you could even argue that pursuing this kind of righteous wealth is part of the point of being a layperson. That as the layperson, really, their life is one of gaining wealth, a righteous wealth that is ethically gained wealth, that we then use to distribute to worthy people in our lives and to make our lives happier and the lives of people around us happier. This may seem surprising. I actually have a course on this over at the Online Dharma Institute in case you're interested, but this is one of the features of early Buddhism. And now, if we can see that even gaining wealth is not a problem for the Buddha as long as we're lay people, then so too are such things as scientific or artistic kinds of aims. If we have an ambition to be a great scientist or a great artist, there's nothing wrong with that in early Buddhism. The point of Buddhist practice is never to kill our passion or our curiosity, and certainly never to become passive. That's not the point. But passion itself can be for good or for ill. Passion is simply a kind of a strong desire to do something. It's like power. It can be used for good or ill. And there are many ways, many of us who have passions to do things that are helpful. We can have passions to help our neighbors. Indeed, one of the ways we can understand business, both nowadays and in the past, is that many ethical businesses exist, and when we might even say that business in general, insofar as we look at the ethical part of it, exists in order to help people. Everything that we have around us comes from a business of some kind. The clothing we wear, the books that we read, the furniture in our houses themselves, our transportation, our internet service, phone service, cell service, everything. All of it comes, or almost all of it, much of it comes to one degree or another from businesses that are constructed in order to help people. So to that degree, to the degree that we're involved in something that's helping others, there's nothing wrong with that. But we can also be passionate in other ways. In, let's say, selling snake oils, things that don't work, trying to trick people. In perhaps distributing misinformation about climate change in order to deceive people. In perhaps trying to take wealth from the powerless, who are less able to resist our wiles, our attempts. There are ways, of course, of being passionate that are harmful to others. And the basic aim of Buddhist practice and Buddhist Dharma in general is to begin to allow us to see more clearly the differences between helpful and unhelpful passions like these. Passion is basically emotional energy or enthusiasm. And like any energy, it itself is amoral. It can be used for good or ill. So the main issue with our passions is to figure out how they're being directed and to try to nudge them to be directed in ways that are skillful for ourselves and for others. Indeed, we can even be passionate about something such as attaining awakening. I did an earlier video on that because we might think that in early Buddhism, passion is always a problem. That certainly is how it's described sometimes, but it's not necessarily. Passion, particularly for awakening, can indeed get us very far along the path. And David mentions curiosity, and curiosity is very much the same. Curiosity is sort of an emotionally intense interest in things. And indeed, it's even the second stage on the 7 factors of awakening. I did an earlier video on the 7 factors of awakening, which I'll also put a link to down below in the show notes if you don't know that. It's known in the 7 factors of awakening as investigation of states. That's how it's termed. But this investigation of states, which comes after mindfulness, first we become mindful, and then we start to investigate states. In other words, we become curious. As our mindfulness grows, we become curious about ourselves. We become curious about the world in certain ways, how it manifests itself in our experience. And we become curious about the interrelation, the interplay between ourselves and the world. And our progress along the path would not be possible without this kind of curiosity. This kind of curiosity is essential to progress. So there's nothing wrong with curiosity itself. In fact, curiosity, as I say, is absolutely essential. We need it. Similarly, though, as with the case of passion, curiosity itself can be for good or for ill. In other words, we can be curious about things that will make our lives better, curious about things that are skillful for us to pursue, and we can also be curious about things that don't. We can really essentially waste our time being curious about things that really are not worth our effort, are not worth our attention. And part of the point of practice is to understand this distinction. Curiosity itself, in other words, is amoral. It doesn't really, it can be for good or for ill. The main point is to direct it properly. Now, some of the nuance here with curiosity comes that for some of us, as we progress along the path, our passion for that path, our passion for practice, may turn our curiosity away from some of the more ordinary parts of life towards the path itself. In other words, we may become more and more curious about the path, and that may draw our attention away from more of the ordinary features of life. And indeed, for some of us, this kind of change in perspective may even lead us to become monastics. In other words, we may decide to give up much of our ordinary life in order to pursue the path completely because we're so curious about it. But I would submit that that's true of very few of us. It may be true of some of us, but very few. It's not something we have to get into if we don't want. There's no pressure here. There's nobody standing behind us telling us we have to give up our ordinary lives or anything like that. That's not the case at all. And indeed, the monastic sangha itself, the group of monastics, require lay support. So it's not as though we could all become monastics tomorrow. I mean, that's not even a possibility. So we have to keep these things in mind. I mean, it's rather like I've known mathematicians in my life, people who pursued mathematics at university, who had very broad interests at one point in their lives, but then as they were drawn into mathematics as a profession, that broad interest basically narrowed until their interest was almost exclusively about things having to do with mathematics. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That simply is a change in perspective as people grow and change all the time. We have to remember that we ourselves are always changing. And so in the same way, our interests, our curiosity may get redirected as we become more aware of what's going on in the path. But we may not. We also may decide that the path as it is fits very well with our ordinary life, and that's fine. But whatever the case may be, none of this would happen because of passivity on our part. It happens rather because of an active interest. Either an active interest in the path and the Dharma that leads us towards, let's say, giving up some of our prior interests, finding them less important, because we find our present interest with the path leading towards such great happiness in our lives that we want to pursue it further. Or we may find, as I say, that our passion for the path is perfectly compatible with our ordinary life and that we can do it all together. It just depends on the person. Everyone is different. However, I think what would happen as we progress along is that as we get farther, we will find ourselves, I think, disentangling our ordinary passions or ordinary ambitions from, let's say, a more closed down conceit about ourselves. Because I think in ordinary life, if we're not familiar with Buddhist practice, what can happen is that our passions, our ambition, gets caught up with conceit, gets caught up with a feeling that we are special, that we're different, that we're somehow unique, that we're somehow doing this all by ourselves, that it's who we are as a self, as a person, that makes us greater than others. This kind of conceit that puts ourselves up on a pedestal. And this is oftentimes what happens, I think, with people who become successful in their lives, is that if they don't have a strong kind of, let's say, wisdom upbringing, this can go to their heads, and they think that it's all done by themselves, that it makes them special in some way. And part of our progress along this path is a learning that that kind of ambition, that kind of conceit, is not really an ambition for true happiness. It's an ambition that leads to our own attachment to things in the world that's going to make our lives more difficult in the long term, and certainly that's going to make the lives of people around us and the greater society more difficult in the long term. Because if we put ourselves up on a pedestal, we're liable to push everybody down, and that's not to our own benefit nor to the benefit of others. So what we begin to understand, I think, as we progress here, is that the path is one that leads towards happiness, and that other kinds of more conceited or selfish understandings of ambition and passion are not really the ways towards true happiness. I did an earlier video on Buddhism and happiness and how Buddhism talks about this issue, and I'll put a link to it up on the screen. I'd recommend taking a look at it. Thanks so much to all of you, and I hope we'll catch you on the next video. Meanwhile, all of you be well.